It was London in the year 1815, a world where a woman's future hung on the delicate threads of reputation and marriage prospects, where choices were few and second chances rarer still. This is the story of Marigold Thornfield, who once stood ready to pledge her heart and hearth to the only man she'd ever loved, only to find herself cold and alone, and of James Kentwood, who vanished without explanation, leaving whispers and scandal in his wake. What happens when fate reunites them after 5 long years? When truth emerges from shadow and the heart must decide whether to trust again. In the elegant drawing room of Harrington House, Marigold Thornfield adjusted the elderly Duchess's shawl with practised care. At 27, 5 years as a lady's companion had taught Marigold to move quietly, to blend into the background like faded wallpaper. She had become what society expected of unmarried women of her station: invisible, useful, and forgotten. What the gossiping society ladies didn't know was that Marigold Thornfield had once worn a wedding gown, had once stood before the altar of St. Mary's with hope in her heart and a future within her grasp, until the groom who promised her everything simply disappeared. "Marigold, dear, you're 1,000 miles away again," the Duchess remarked, her rheumy eyes surprisingly sharp beneath her wrinkled lids. "Thinking of your past again?" "No, Your Grace, the past has nothing to offer me," Marigold replied with a practised smile, the lie coming easily after years of rehearsal. Her fingers smoothed an invisible wrinkle from the Duchess's shawl, betraying her disquiet. "Well, remember my nephew arrives today," the Duchess continued, setting aside her embroidery and adjusting her spectacles. "He sent word of his arrival in London yesterday. I expect you to make him welcome when he calls this afternoon." Marigold only nodded dutifully, fixing her gaze on the pattern of the carpet beneath her feet. That afternoon, as she arranged fresh spring flowers in the Duchess's drawing room, the elderly woman sat by the window, examining the society pages with a magnifying glass. The rustle of paper punctuated the quiet ticking of the mantel clock. "Mr. James Kentwood, Your Grace," the butler announced from the doorway. Marigold looked up, her fingers suddenly numb. The crystal vase slipped from her grasp, shattering against the marble floor. It seemed as if her heart was breaking all over again, because here was the man who had betrayed her all those years ago. Broader of shoulder, his skin sun-bronzed from years in India, dark hair touched with threads of silver at the temples. Her eyes traced the changes without conscious consent. James, the man whose name she had forbidden herself to speak since that terrible day. His eyes met hers across the room, widening with unmistakable recognition, before his face paled beneath its tan. "Marigold," his voice was barely above a whisper, her name on his tongue carrying a vulnerable tenderness she refused to let herself believe. The Duchess looked between them with newfound interest, her withered hand rising to her throat. "You are acquainted with my companion nephew?" "We were," James began, his voice rough with emotion. "Barely acquainted," Marigold finished, kneeling to gather the larger shards of crystal with trembling hands. "From another lifetime, Your Grace. There is a particular kind of torture in being trapped within the same walls as the person who broke your heart." For Marigold, Harrington House had transformed overnight into a labyrinth of jagged memories. Memories that threatened to cut open wounds she'd long grown used to pretending had already healed. In the days that followed, a careful dance began between them, one desperate to avoid the ghost of their lost love, and one desperate to revive it. A week into this careful choreography, the Duchess summoned Marigold to her private sitting room. The elderly woman peered at the wan face of the young woman before her. "Marigold," she said without preamble, settling her lace shawl around her shoulders. Whatever history lies between you and my nephew is becoming tiresome. You jump like a startled rabbit whenever he appears. Marigold stared at the carpet, heat creeping up her neck. I apologize if my behaviour has been unprofessional, Your Grace. Unprofessional, the Duchess snorted delicately. Girl, you act as though he's carrying the plague. Out with it. What did James do to earn such animosity? Marigold's fingers twisted in her skirts. We were engaged to be married, Your Grace. He changed his mind rather abruptly. The Duchess's eyebrows rose toward her lace cap. Changed his mind? James, that boy has the stubbornness of an ox. He's never changed his mind about anything in his life. Nevertheless, Marigold said quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, he disappeared the day of our wedding, without explanation. The Duchess was silent for a long moment, her bright eyes studying Marigold. I see, she finally said. Well, that explains a great deal, including why he's never married. Later that evening, Marigold sought refuge in the library, listening to the spring rain lash against the windows. There was comfort in books. They never disappointed, never abandoned, never broke promises. The door opened and there stood James, stopping short when he saw her. Forgive me, he said stiffly. I didn't realise you were here. I was just leaving. Marigold gathered her shawl with trembling hands, the book of poetry she'd been reading forgotten on the window seat. Marigold, wait. His voice held a desperate edge she'd never heard before. 5 minutes, please. Perhaps it was the storm outside, or that desperation that had caught at her heart, even after all these years. But Marigold paused. She retreated to the window seat, as far from him as the room allowed. 5 minutes, she conceded, arranging her skirts with careful precision. He remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. I never thought I'd find you here, of all places. Your aunt has been kind to me. Her answer troubled him. Why had she needed such kindness? I searched for you, he said abruptly, for 3 years. Marigold's fingers stilled. 3 years? You returned from India early then. I made my fortune faster than anticipated. He approached slowly. When I returned, your father told me something I still don't understand. And what was that? Her voice was carefully controlled. He said you had agreed to marry Lord Blackwood, but disappeared the night before the wedding. James watched her face closely. He claimed you had chosen Blackwood's wealth over waiting for me. Marigold stood suddenly, colour draining from her face. That's what he told you. That I chose to marry Blackwood. Thunder crashed outside as James stopped, confusion evident in his expression. Didn't you? Your father showed me the engagement announcement in the paper. An announcement I knew nothing about until it was published. Lightning illuminated the space between them as Marigold's composure cracked. I never agreed to marry Blackwood. My father arranged it all after you left. James's expression hardened. That wasn't our agreement. I went to India because your father swore he would give you my letter explaining everything and that you would be free to wait for me if you chose. There was no letter, James. The words hung between them. There was only the news of your sudden departure and my father's announcement that I was to marry Lord Blackwood within the month. James turned to the fire, gripping the mantle. He betrayed us both, then. When I learned about the engagement to Blackwood, I thought... Marigold hesitated. I thought perhaps you had discovered my father's financial troubles and left rather than take on his debts. I left to pay those debts, James said quietly. To free you from the marriage your father had secretly arranged to Blackwood. I knew his reputation, his previous wives. Died under suspicious circumstances, Marigold finished. That's why I fled the night before that wedding. I left a note saying I would rather be a servant than Blackwood's wife. James turned back to her, understanding dawning in his eyes. While I was working to free you from that very fate, I was a fool to believe your father. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document, placing it on the table between them. Every penny of your father's debt, paid 3 years ago. When I returned, I found you gone, and your father claiming no knowledge of your whereabouts, only that you had changed your mind about Blackwood. My father died, believing I had shamed the family name. Marigold's whisper barely carried above the rain. The daughter who ran from a respectable match. No one would have me after that scandal. Lady's companion was the best position I could secure. You weren't running from a respectable match, James said, his voice thick with emotion. You were escaping a fate I had gone halfway around the world to prevent. Their eyes met across 5 years of deliberate deception. He looked at her with such longing, such aching tenderness, that she longed to run across the shattered dreams that stretched between them and throw herself into his arms. But she held herself very still. In the weeks that followed, the walls between them began to crumble. Marigold learned of his years in India, the spice trade that had made his fortune, the malarial fever that had nearly claimed his life. He learned of her father's death, her sister's fortunate marriage, her quiet years of service. One rainy afternoon, she found him in the music room, staring at the piano with a far-away expression. You used to play, he said softly, looking up as she entered. Do you still? Sometimes, when the Duchess requests it. Would you play now? For me? Marigold hesitated, then sat on the bench. Her fingers found the opening notes of the Mozart sonata that had once been his favourite. As she played, she felt him sit beside her, his presence warm and solid, a presence she had trained herself to forget. I kept this, he said when she finished, pulling a small object from his pocket. A pressed violet, brown with age, from the first bouquet I ever gave you. She touched it gently, remembering the shy young man who had once placed fresh violets in her hands. I kept nothing, she admitted. I couldn't bear the reminders. His hand covered hers on the keys, warm and calloused from years of work. I never stopped loving you, Marigold. Not for a single day. Her eyes met his, searching for the truth. How can I trust that? You can't, he said simply. Not yet. But I hope to earn that trust again, if you'll allow me the chance. And slowly, a tender dance of trust began between them. The Duchess's annual spring ball arrived with all the splendour London society had come to expect, a glittering affair of silks and jewels, music and laughter. As her companion, Marigold oversaw the arrangements with efficiency, knowing her role was to remain in the shadows once the guests arrived. She wore her simplest gown, serviceable grey silk, absent of adornment, and prepared for an evening of quiet observation from the periphery. James arrived late, his tall figure commanding attention as he made his way through the crowd. His eyes found Marigold instantly, as though she were the only person in the room. He moved toward her with purpose, ignoring the pretty young debutantes who angled for his attention. Dance with me, he said simply, extending his hand. Marigold shook her head. I'm not a guest, James. I'm the help. You are Marigold Thornfield, daughter of Baron Thornfield, and the only woman I have ever loved, he replied, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Dance with me. The Duchess, watching from her throne-like chair, nodded her approval with a sly smile that suggested she had anticipated this moment. Marigold placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor as whispers bloomed around them. "People are staring," she murmured as he drew her into the waltz. "Let them," he said, his hand warm against her back. "Marigold, I've been a coward, not 5 years ago, but these past weeks. I should have told you immediately." "Told me what?" The music swelled around them as he guided her through a turn. "I came to London with one purpose, to find you. Aunt Harrington's invitation was providential. I had no idea you were her companion." Marigold's steps faltered. "You were looking for me?" "Of course. After your father." His voice trailed off for a moment. Then he began again. "I lost track of you. Every lead went cold." His grip tightened. "When I walked into that drawing room and saw you, it was like seeing a ghost, the ghost of every hope I'd ever had." As the dance ended, he did not release her hand, but led her toward the terrace doors. The night air was cool against her flushed skin as they stood beneath the stars. Beyond the garden, London sprawled out before them. "I have imagined this moment 1,000 times," he said quietly. "What I would say if I ever found you again." "And what would you say?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the distant music. "That I was wrong to agree to your father's terms, that I should have told you the truth and faced whatever came together, that there has not been a single night in 5 years when I haven't dreamed of your face." He took both her hands in his. "That I love you still, Marigold. That I will love you until my last breath." She stared up at him, this man who had been both villain and hero in the story of her life. "How can I trust that you won't disappear again? Because this time, I'm asking you to disappear with me." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Marry me, Marigold. Let's finally begin our life together. Not here in London with its gossip and painful memories, but in India. We can build a new life there, far from the shadows of the past." Tears blurred her vision as 5 years of carefully maintained walls crumbled to dust. "You once left me standing alone." "And I have paid for that decision every day since," he said hoarsely. "I cannot change the past, Marigold. I can only offer you the future. All of it. Everything I have and am. There are moments in life that serve as crossroads, moments when we must choose between the safety of our walls and the risk of choosing everything we'd ever dreamed of. For Marigold Thornfield, who had learned to live without hope, that moment had arrived. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, James." 3 months later, beneath a sky painted with sunrise, Marigold and James stood on the deck of the Morning Star, watching the English coastline recede into mist. His arm was warm around her waist, his wedding ring catching the light as he pointed out a distant sail on the horizon. The Duchess had given them her blessing with surprising enthusiasm. "At my age, one recognises true love when one sees it," she had said at their small wedding. "Besides, I've been playing matchmaker since you arrived, nephew. Why do you think I requested Marigold as my companion after meeting her at Lady Whitmore's luncheon? I recognised the name immediately from your letters." James had stared at his aunt in astonishment. "You knew? All this time?" The old woman had simply smiled, tapping her cane with a satisfied air. "Sometimes fate needs a little nudge in the right direction." As England disappeared from view, Marigold felt the last threads of her old life release their hold. The abandoned bride, the impoverished companion, those were the ghosts now, left behind on distant shores. Any regrets? James asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. She turned in his arms, studying the beloved face she had once thought lost to her forever. Only the years we lost. But perhaps we needed those years apart to become the people we are now. There are love stories that unfold simply, following the straight path from meeting to marriage, and then there are those that take detours through heartbreak and sacrifice, separation and return. Perhaps the greatest love stories are written not in that first enfolding flush, but in the weathered heartbeats of those who have learned what it means to lose everything, and then find it again when least expected.